Hello, this is a collaboration between many labs. It started in Maastricht under Benedict Poser and is now being continued in my new lab under Peter Bandettini with a lot of input from many experts in the field. And I have no financial interests to disclose with respect to this presentation. fMRI with echoplanar imaging is an awesomely efficient method, and it has come a long way across improvements across many decades. And it can give fine-scale functional details up to the level of these cortical layers or columns. But, and that's a big but, as attendees of this artifact session, you might know that EPI is not perfect, specifically when you look at single TR images and when you know where to look for it. For example, there's kind of a dark shadow, very fuzzy, sitting on top of this side, as opposed to that side, for example. And there are these kind of fuzzy clouds, these banana clouds sitting right on top there. Do you see that artifact? To be honest, at the beginning, I didn't really see it myself without a bit of training, but I'm gonna help you and just invert the artifact and make any dark shadows become bright clouds or bright clouds become dark shadows. So you can see that there's a lot of variance going on here. Many of the 200 published papers in the history of layer-dependent fMRI make their data publicly available. And I found this very artifact in literally every single dataset. They are usually visible as these kind of dark shadows, kind of fuzzy, in the low spatial frequency domains and are visible across protocols and vendors. And they should not be confused with conventional off-resonance effects. They are much more fuzzy and in the low spatial frequency domains. And these fuzzy ripples, as we call them, they keep us from pushing to higher spatial temporal resolution protocols. For example, if I take a relatively standard whole brain 0.8mm protocol, it takes quite a while to acquire it. So to push it from 5 seconds to 4 seconds to 3 seconds to 2 seconds, ultimately I do end up with unusable data. But the reason why those data are unusable is not just kind of salt-pepper thermal noise, no, it's the fuzzy ripples that take over. Or similarly for the spatial resolution, when I take a conventional 0.8 protocol and push it to go to 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, again, I end up with unusable data, not only because of salt-pepper noise, but mostly because of the fuzzy ripples. To explain where these fuzzy ripples come from, let's look at an EPI echo train, where we have ramp sampling along the trapezoid, but then when you look at the actual measured gradient, we do of course have eddy currents. And even though the eddy current compensation is already quite aggressive that it overcompensates the falling corner, there's quite a bit of error left at the rising corners still. And these resulting gradient errors are very sparse in k-space, so they cannot be accounted for with small grappa kernels. And since those gradient errors have the same polarity, they cannot be accounted for with conventional phase correction methods. So while we would like to end up with a k-space sampling like shown down there, regularly we do end up with a k-space sampling like this, where we start at the ramps okay, then we have a delay, we never really catch up, we have another delay, and so on and so forth, going back and forth and back and forth. This means that depending on the phase correction you use, you end up with low spatial frequency Nyquist ghosts, aka the fuzzy ripples that we just looked at. And since these are odd even EPI errors, we can follow previously suggested mitigation strategies that have been suggested for other issues, for example, off-resonance effects. And there are countless papers about this. The ones that got me into it was mostly the abstract from Rüdiger Stirnberg last year, as well as work from Poser and van der Zwag, namely proposing a dual polarity approach, where you go through k-space in reverse polarity, which then gives you the exact same artifact with an opposite sign. So mathematically speaking, taking the complex valued average of those two images should cancel out the artifact completely and be identical to the same as having a complex valued average of those consistently irregular k-space sampling patterns without artifacts. And you can implement this, for example, with alternating TR polarities, or also based on a quick calibration scan. And depending on which reconstruction method you use, this might reduce your temporal specificity. With the reward, however, that it allows you to do experiments that were not achievable without doing this. For example, doing 0.5mm isotropic 3 Tesla imaging, where just 15 minutes of data sampling is enough during movie watching to give you quite nice connectivity maps. Another application example would be 7 Tesla, where these fuzzy ripples are usually limiting kind of the ventral stream or deep brain area sensitivities. Here, for example, aiming to look at phase representations in the amygdala, where the dual polarity approach not only shows you nice ventral FFA activity, but also these very tiny subnuclei of the amygdala. Or when you're pushing the Fine-Bergertron head gradient to perform whole brain 0.6 mm, the dual polarity averaging again allows to make unusable data usable and give you quite nice whole brain blood volume connectivity maps out of it. To compare this approach with other popular methods, I chose to look at the notoriously challenging auditory areas, which do often suffer from off-resonance effects as well as the fuzzy ripples. And the dual polarity grappa approach, proposed by Hoke and Polimeni, can nicely mitigate the off-resonance effects, though the sparse errors in k-space of the fuzzy ripples are still there though. Similarly, for a 3D EPI that can dilute and spread out the off-resonance effects in the second phase encoding direction, and it is more inherently robust to that, the fuzzy ripples, however, are still there. And while the images might not look too bad on a first glance, when you just invert the artifact, you can see how bad the artifact still is. With the dual polarity averaging approach, however, it can nicely flatten out either of those artifacts, of resonance effects as well as fuzzy ripples. To highlight the different origin of the fuzzy ripples and eddy currents during ramp sampling from the more general off-resonance effects, I would like to show you this experiment series here, where I'm showing you the EPI as well as the dual polarity difference as a measure of ghost level. So in an ideal world, this would be completely flat. So when I do an EPI without ramp sampling, only sampling on the flat top, I'm not sensitive to all of the spikes over here, and I end up with relatively weak fuzzy ripples. Now when I switch on ramp sampling, I'm also sensitive to all the spikes here, and basically ending up with strong fuzzy ripples in the low spatial frequency domains. And then turning on grappa, which relies on known aliasing, it is now confused with all these erroneous ghosts in there. So basically amplifying any kind of ghosts that are in there already. This is very different from off-resonance effects. For example, when I make the shim a bit bad on purpose, I do not end up with these kind of smooth spatial frequency ghosts, but instead I end up with these edge ghosts that have spatial structures. You see the ventricles and you see the edge of the brain and these edge ghosts. This is not the fuzzy ripples. Then doing dual polarity averaging gets rid of these fuzzy ripples quite nicely. While we tested this dual polarity approach mostly on 3D EPI with alternating TRs, it does show similarly promising results when using a single image reverse polarity calibration, here visible as reduced ghost levels as implemented in the 2D CMRR multiband sequence. And with this, I would like to thank all my colleagues, and I thank you for your attention.